In 1948, Richard Wade Farley, like many children in military families, was born into a family of constant change. He was the oldest of 6 children and found himself trudging from home to home as he and his siblings followed their parents from city to city and state to state. Eventually, after years of nearly constant traveling, the Farleys settled in California, where Richard finished his high school and went to get his college education. At school, Richard found it difficult to get along with others and didn't have very many close friends. He was often bullied and ostracized, and that seemed to go for his home life as well. Despite being one of 6 siblings, the children later claimed that no one in the family was particularly close, and one of his brothers had even gone 10 years without speaking to Richard at all. Despite that, Richard did like so many children born into military families do, and signed up for the service himself. Richard joined the Navy and served for a total of 10 years before moving back to California, maybe the first place that Richard could think of as his home. It was there, in California, that Richard began his new career as a software technician at Electromagnetic Systems Labs, Inc., a company that develops reconnaissance software and technology. But it was far from the place where Richard began to flourish. It was during his 10 years at ESL that Richard Farley met Laura Black, a young and talented 22-year-old electrical engineer. In his own words, the then 35-year-old Richard fell in love with Laura at first sight, and he was determined to do everything he could to win her over. He began by leaving Laura handwritten letters and homemade gifts on her desk. He kept telling Laura how he felt about her and asked her out on several occasions, but every time he did, Laura politely refused. The feelings that Richard was feeling weren't mutual, and Laura later said that when dealing with Richard and his constant advances, she, quote, tried really to ignore him, but to be cordial. But it looked like Richard was not getting the message. The more she tries to push me away, the more I try not to have her push me away, Richard later said when his letters and home-baked goods didn't seem to be doing the trick. Richard dialed things up a notch. He tried calling her work phone to talk to her every few hours. He talked to the janitors and tried to get a copy of her desk keys, and then he found ways to invade Laura's personal life too. Richard talked to the HR department and talked them into handing over Laura's personal phone number and her address. After that, it was like the floodgates truly opened. Richard began sending letters to Laura at her home address multiple times a week. He constantly called her. He loitered outside of her house. He showed up at her aerobics class. He photoshopped pictures of the two of them together and then sent those to her as well. In the 4 years that they knew each other, Richard sent Laura over 200 letters to her home addresses. And yes, I said addresses because Laura ended up moving several times in an attempt to get away from Richard, and every time he managed to track her down again. Finally, in 1985, after enduring years of this, Laura asked the HR department at ESL for help with dealing with Richard. Realizing that Richard had gone way overboard, HR ordered him to attend psychological counseling that did not seem to work in the slightest. Instead of calming down and trying to go unnoticed now that he was on management's radar, Richard doubled down on his harassment of Laura and even spread his campaign further. When his colleagues began trying to defend and protect Laura from Richard, Richard started threatening them as well. A male colleague and friend confronted Richard and warned him that he would end up in jail if he didn't stop what he was doing to Laura. Richard responded by typing a letter to Laura and mailing it to her home address. Quote, "It's not in your best interest for him to interfere. He doesn't have any idea what he's getting into. You'd better tell him. I'd better not see any police around me." Needless to say, management at ESL figured out that there was no changing Richard's behavior. His constant harassment of Laura had also begun to affect his own work and the hours that he was spending in the office. So after employing him for over 9 years, ESL fired Richard. Richard returned the favor by finding work at rival companies like Covalent Systems Corporation, but the truth was that his fixation with Laura was far from over. "You cost me a job," $40,000 in equity taxes I can't pay, and foreclosure. Yet, I still like you." He later wrote to Laura, "Why do you want to find out how far I'll go? I absolutely will not be pushed around, and I'm beginning to get tired of being nice." Things escalated even further in 1988 when Laura, now at her wit's end, after years of being stalked, filed for a temporary restraining order against Richard. Her case went to court on February 17th, just over 2 weeks later, to see if her restraining order would be made permanent. Richard was fuming at this. In his mind, he and Laura had been in a real relationship all these years, and now she was trying to turn the tables on him. He sent a package to her lawyer with documents and evidence that he believed proved that he and Laura were in fact dating. It included hotel receipts, a written tale of the drugs the two of them had allegedly shared, and pictures of Richard and Laura together. Laura's lawyer later said that they believed everything in that package had been fabricated. With the court date looming, Richard realized that he was on the verge of losing Laura for good. Not that he ever really had her. To combat that, he began buying and adding to his collection of guns and ammunition. The day before going to court, Richard drove his motorhome to a familiar spot. He parked right outside ESL, California, and waited for Laura to come out after her day at work. In his mind, he was either going to convince Laura to drop the restraining order then and there, or he was going to kill himself. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Richard loaded 8 different guns with ammunition, packed an extra 1,000 rounds, a smoke bomb, a foot-long buck knife, and strapped on his bulletproof vest to confront the woman he'd been obsessing over for years. But as soon as Richard stepped out of his motorhome, he began firing and shooting at anyone in front of him. He headed to the side entrance, shot out the glass so he could walk in, and started stalking the corridors towards Laura's office. He shot and killed 7 of his former co-workers and wounded another 3 before he finally arrived at his intended target. Laura spotted Richard coming and slammed the door in his face in a desperate attempt to get away from him, but Richard managed to get the door open and positioned his gun so that he could fire at Laura. He hit her in the shoulder, completely shattering the joint and collapsing her lung in the process. Laura hit the ground, covered in blood, and unconscious from her injuries, and that's, maybe, what saved her life. Thinking that his mission was complete, Richard then sat tight and kept the arriving SWAT team busy for a further 5 hours. During that time, Laura regained consciousness and managed to escape with employees who were also hiding from Richard. During talks with the police negotiator, Richard reportedly cried, showed remorse for the lives he'd taken and the damage he'd done that day, and he threatened to kill himself. Richard also confessed that during the years he'd been stalking Laura, he'd lost 2 homes, his car and computer, and had fallen over $20,000 behind in his taxes. He was eventually convinced to come out and surrender to the police once his condition of a turkey sandwich and a Diet Coke were met. The court date he'd been dreading so much went ahead the following day, where the judge, maybe to no one's surprise, made Laura's restraining order permanent. With tears in her eyes, the judge commented, "Pieces of paper do not stop bullets." A statement that especially hit hard at a time when no one was certain whether Laura would actually recover from her injuries or not. At trial, for the 7 murders he'd committed that day, Richard and his lawyers attempted to argue that Richard wasn't normally a violent person, but he'd been blinded by his obsession with Laura. The prosecution fired back and claimed that Richard's behavior that day and the weeks leading up to it, where he'd bought and stockpiled several new guns and rounds of ammunition, proved that the attack had been premeditated. The courts agreed and found Richard guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, but due to California's lengthy appeals process, he is still currently behind bars waiting his execution to this day. Laura fortunately survived the attack and the injuries she sustained that day. She continued to work at ESL for several more years after that, but almost unbelievably, she would hear from Richard one last time. He wrote one final letter to Laura from his prison cell. In it, he stated that Laura had finally won. But it's safe to say that none of this was a game for Laura or for the rest of her coworkers who were deeply affected and harmed by Richard's actions throughout the years of constant harassment and stalking. In the wake of this stalking that led to a mass shooting, along with the high-profile murder of actress Rebecca Schaeffer, which I also covered in an episode in April called Robert the Celebrity Stalker, California passed the first anti-stalking laws in the nation. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to 10-Minute Murder. If you're a new listener, hit subscribe before you go. Also, follow on social media. Links from the show notes, or you can go to 10minutemurder.com to find the links. If you want to send me an email, you can do that, joe@10minutemurder.com. And here is one from Byron in South Dakota. Good morning, Joe. We had a good chuckle this morning. My coworker had unloaded some random things from a pickup last night and then left them laying on the floor in my workspace. At first glance, it's just a pile of random stuff. But as I walked over to him to ask him to move the items, a totally different idea came to mind. So when I approached Ryan, I asked, "So whom are we burying today?" As you might guess, he was a little confused, and I said, "You know, your burial kit over there. Looks like you've been hiding bodies or getting ready to. You've got a shovel, some chairs, a cooler for taking breaks, a tent to keep the sun off of you, and a big bag for the body." He just looked at me and chuckled. He knew exactly why the idea had come to mind, and we both blurted out, 10-Minute Murder. And so, well, it's official, Joe. You finally corrupted us both. Or maybe I did it to him when I turned him on to the podcast 1 year ago. Myself, I've been a loyal fan since you started. Thanks for the stories, hard work, and dedication to your followers. Have a good day, sir. That's from Byron in South Dakota. And let me tell you, he attached photos. And me being me, as soon as I open an email and see photos, that's the first thing I look at. I thought I was going to have to get the police involved right away because that does, in fact, look like some burial kit. So then I read the email and realized, oh yeah, okay, this isn't what that is. But it was a close call. I thought I was going to have to call the cops on Byron, but all good. And Byron, thank you so much for listening to the podcast and turning your coworker/friend, Ryan, on to listening to it. And that's going to do it. That's your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder.